Hi guys, here's a question. What would you do as an 18-year-old ruler to restore peace to a burning empire? I know it's not a question most people ever face, yet it haunted me after I inherited Rome from my assassinated uncle. My name is Gaius Octavius, though you probably know me as Augustus, and tonight I will recount how I transformed a broken republic, bleeding from civil war, into the Pax Romana, the remarkable peace that would last for generations. But before we jump into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're tuning in from, and which figure from Italy's fascinating history inspires you most. Share your thoughts in the comments, and perhaps their stories will be told in a future episode. Now that everything's settled, it's time to relax. Dim the lights, let the world's noise fade, and come with me as we journey back through time. We begin not at the triumphant end, but at the moment when I first learned my fate, when the quiet of my youth was shattered forever by the burden of legacy. The Rome of my childhood was a place of crumbling tradition and dangerous ambition. You could feel the tension in the very air of the forum, the whispered conspiracies, the uneasy alliances that shifted like sand. The republic we claimed to cherish was tearing itself apart, decade after decade of civil strife leaving deep scars on the city's soul. Senators plotted against each other while the common people suffered, and the old virtues that built our nation seemed like distant memories. Meanwhile, my great-uncle, Julius Caesar, stood as a colossal figure in this fractured landscape. He was like a force of nature, brilliant, ambitious, and utterly transformative. To some he was a saviour, to others a tyrant, but to all he was unavoidable. He represented both the problem and the potential solution, a man who could command armies and rewrite the rules of power itself. I grew up far from this political chaos, in the quiet country town of Velletray. My childhood there was simple, almost ordinary. I studied rhetoric and philosophy, learned the values of discipline and duty from my mother, Atia. The air smelled of olive groves and baking bread, not the intrigue and blood of Roman politics. I watched shepherds tend their flocks on hillsides that had seen generations do the same work. This was my world, a world of predictable rhythms and small concerns. The great drama unfolding in Rome felt like a distant storm, something that might never reach our quiet corner of Italy. But blood ties have a way of pulling you into history's current whether you wish it or not. The Macedonian spring air felt cool and clear that morning in Apollonia. I remember studying rhetoric with my tutor, the words of Greek philosophers feeling distant from the realities of power in Rome. The sunlight filtered through the columns of the lecture hall, and for a moment, everything seemed peaceful, orderly. I was completing my education, preparing for a career that might someday include public service, but nothing that would disrupt the quiet progression of a respectable life. The sea breeze carried the scent of pine and salt, and the world felt full of possibility rather than danger. Then everything changed. A messenger arrived, covered in dust from the road, his face grim with news he clearly dreaded to deliver. He knelt before me, and I can still see the way his hands trembled as he offered the sealed dispatch. The wax seal bore Caesar's imprint, but the handwriting was not his. That was the first wrong note in the symphony of that day. The message should have come from Caesar himself, celebrating his recent victories. Instead, it carried words that would redefine my existence completely. The news of the Ides of March struck me not as information but as a physical blow. Caesar dead? Murdered in the Senate house by men he trusted? The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the comfortable certainties of my studies evaporating in an instant. My great-uncle, the most powerful man in Rome, struck down by daggers in a place that should have been sacred. The rhetoric and philosophy I had been studying suddenly felt like children's games compared to the brutal reality of Roman politics. Then came the staggering realization. In his will, Caesar had named me his adopted son and principal heir. I was no longer simply Gaius Octavius, student from Velitrae. In that moment, I became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, heir to a murdered man's legacy, his political faction, and most dangerously his enemies. The weight of that name settled on my shoulders like marble. Every eye in Rome would now be watching me, measuring me against the colossal shadow of the man I was supposed to replace. The peaceful future I had imagined vanished, replaced by a path strewn with danger and impossible expectations. The journey back to Rome felt like moving through a dreamscape of threats. Every stranger on the road might be an assassin sent by the liberators. Every friendly face might conceal betrayal. I was a target before I even reached the city gates, a boy carrying a name that meant both power and peril. The cool Macedonian spring felt a world away as we travelled south, the weight of my new identity growing heavier with each mile. The quiet student from Apollonia was gone, replaced by a figure who would have to navigate the most dangerous waters in the world. The Rome I returned to was a city of whispers and drawn daggers. You could feel the tension in the very air, the way people glanced over their shoulders in the forum, the hushed conversations that stopped when strangers approached. The cobblestones seemed to remember the blood spilled on the Ides of March, and every shadow felt like it concealed another plot. This wasn't the glorious capital I'd imagined from my studies. It was a wounded beast, dangerous and unpredictable. The Republic was bleeding, and vultures circled overhead, waiting to see who would claim the carcass. Marcus Antonius viewed me as nothing more than a boy, an inconvenient heir to the legacy he believed should be his. He had been Caesar's right hand, his battle-hardened general, and he saw my youth as weakness, my studious nature as irrelevance. When I went to claim my inheritance, both the funds and the political standing Caesar had left me, Antony met me with cold dismissal. He brushed aside my legal claims as if they were childish fantasies, blocking access to the funds that were rightfully mine. The money wasn't just wealth. It was the means to reward Caesar's loyal veterans, to build the foundation of power I would desperately need. That cold reception taught me my first real lesson in Roman politics. Respect is never given, only taken. You don't receive power because documents say you should. You earn it through strength, cunning, and the loyalty you can command. Antony thought he could freeze me out, that I would retreat to the countryside and vanish into obscurity. But in that moment of dismissal, something hardened within me. I looked at this powerful man who saw me as beneath his notice, and I understood that I would have to build my own power base from the ground up, so I made a calculated decision. I would start with Caesar's veterans. These were men who had fought alongside my adopted father, who believed in his vision for Rome, and who felt betrayed by his murder. While Antony courted the Senate with grand gestures, I went directly to the camps outside Rome. I spoke with centurions and common soldiers, listening to their grievances, reminding them of Caesar's legacy, and quietly using what funds I could gather to show my commitment to their cause. It was a dangerous game, a teenager appealing to battle-hardened soldiers, but I learned to speak their language, to understand their loyalties. Slowly, tentatively, they began to see me not as a boy, but as Caesar's true heir. The lion's den had rejected me, so I would build my own pride. The grim necessity of the prescriptions remains the darkest chapter of those early years, a bloody business we undertook to fund our war against Caesar's assassins. We posted lists of names in the forum, senators, wealthy equestrians, anyone deemed a threat to our cause or whose property we needed. their lives and estates were forfeit. I remember watching citizens crowding around those notices, some weeping, others calculating how they might benefit. The air smelled of fear and opportunity, a sickening combination that still haunts my memory. We told ourselves it was for the greater good, that Rome needed stability at any cost, but the truth was we were funding an army with the blood of Roman citizens. Necessary evil is still evil, and no amount of political justification can wash that stain away. Out of this brutality came an uneasy alliance with Antony and Lepidus, the second triumvirate that would rule Rome with absolute power. We met on a small river island, the three of us, surrounded by our troops watching each other across the water. The negotiations lasted days, each of us bargaining for provinces, for commands, for a share of the coming spoils. We formed this partnership not from trust or shared vision, but from mutual need. The assassins had gathered their forces in Greece, and only together could we field an army large enough to confront them. We divided the Roman world between us like merchants splitting a shipment of goods, though the goods in question were millions of lives. The pursuit of Caesar's assassins led us to the fields of Philippi in Macedonia, where 2 battles would decide Rome's future. The first engagement went poorly. Antony fought brilliantly on the right flank, while my forces on the left were pushed back. I was ill during much of the campaign, my body failing me at the worst possible moment. They had to carry me from the field on a litter, my lungs burning with fever even as the battle raged around me. When we finally prevailed in the second battle, the victory felt bitter rather than triumphant. Brutus and Cassius lay dead by their own hands, the so-called liberators of the Republic defeated. But what had we truly won? The Republic died at Philippi as surely as the assassins did. With their defeat, the last hope of restoring the old system vanished. We had crushed the men who killed Caesar, but in doing so we had become exactly what they feared. Absolute rulers with armies loyal to individuals rather than institutions. The bitter victory left me physically weakened and morally conflicted. We had avenged Caesar, but we had also confirmed that power in Rome now flowed from the sword, not the Senate. The division of the world that followed, Antony taking the east, myself the west, Lepidus Africa, sowed the seeds of the next conflict even as we celebrated our triumph. While I worked to rebuild Rome's institutions and stabilize the West, Antony in the East was succumbing to a different vision entirely, the charms and politics of Cleopatra. He established his court in Alexandria, surrounded by Egyptian splendor rather than Roman austerity. The reports that reached Rome painted a disturbing picture. A Roman general adopting Eastern customs, holding court like a Hellenistic king, and increasingly influenced by the Ptolemaic queen's ambitions. The distance between Rome and Alexandria wasn't just geographical. It was becoming a chasm between 2 fundamentally different visions of power. I believed in restoring Rome's traditions while modernizing its administration. Antony seemed to be creating something entirely new and foreign to Roman sensibilities. The propaganda war began slowly, then intensified as the years passed. I made sure Rome heard about Antony's excesses, his disregard for Roman traditions, his growing identification with Egyptian rather than Roman interests. We circulated letters and accounts that portrayed him not as a Roman statesman, but as a man bewitched by a foreign queen, losing himself in Eastern decadence while I worked to strengthen the Republic at home. The slow turning of Roman opinion against a would-be king became one of my most careful political projects. I never attacked Antony directly as a Roman general. That would have been too divisive. Instead, I framed it as Rome against Eastern influence, tradition against foreign corruption, Republican values against monarchical ambition. The final, irrevocable break came with the reading of Antony's will in the Senate. When his official documents were seized from the Temple of Vesta, they contained shocking provisions. Requests to be buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra, generous bequests to their children, and most damningly, the designation of Cleopatra's son Caesarion as Caesar's true heir. This was more than personal betrayal. It was a political catastrophe. The document suggested Antony saw his future as lying with Egypt rather than Rome, his loyalties divided at the most fundamental level. The Senate, already primed by years of careful messaging, reacted with outrage that felt genuine rather than orchestrated. The declaration of war that followed was a masterpiece of political framing. We did not declare war on Marcus Antonius, a Roman citizen and former consul. That would have been civil war, something the people were weary of after decades of bloodshed. Instead, we declared war on Cleopatra alone, a foreign queen who had supposedly seduced and corrupted a Roman commander. The fiction allowed Romans to rally against an external threat rather than each other. The mobilization felt different from previous conflicts. This wasn't brother against brother, but Rome defending its identity against foreign influence. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine whether Rome would remain Roman or become something else entirely. The morning of September 2nd dawned clear over the Ionian Sea, that peculiar calm that often precedes great storms, both meteorological and historical. Our combined fleets faced each other across the water, my forces under Agrippa's brilliant command against Antony's larger but less disciplined navy. The air smelled of salt and pitch, and the nervous sweat of thousands of men preparing for battle. You could hear the creak of ships, the occasional shout of command, the gentle lapping of waves against wooden hulls. This wasn't like land battles with their dust and immediate chaos. Naval warfare unfolded with a strange slow-motion tension, every movement visible across the water, every decision carrying immense consequences. Agrippa's brilliance that day was something to behold. The master of the fleet I trusted with my life and the future of Rome. He had designed special grappling hooks and corvus boarding bridges that would negate Antony's advantage in larger ships. His formations were tight, disciplined, responsive to signals in ways Antony's heterogeneous fleet could never match. While Antony's command was divided between Roman officers and Cleopatra's Egyptian admirals, Agrippa's authority was absolute. His sailors drilled to perfection. I watched from my flagship, my illness of previous campaigns thankfully absent, as Agrippa executed maneuvers with the precision of a master chess player. He understood that this battle wouldn't be won by brute force, but by control, by patience, by waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came in the afternoon, when the wind shifted and Antony's line began to lose cohesion. Agrippa feigned a retreat on our left flank, drawing out Antony's heavier ships, then swung around to attack their exposed sides. The grappling hooks found their marks, and our legionaries poured across boarding bridges onto enemy decks. Meanwhile, Cleopatra's squadron, positioned at the rear with the treasury ships, saw an opportunity, or perhaps panicked, and made a sudden break through our lines with sails raised. What happened next remains debated to this day, whether this was planned withdrawal or desperate flight. But the effect was catastrophic for Antony's forces. Seeing their support ships fleeing, his remaining captains lost heart. The line broke not with a dramatic explosion, but with a slow unravelling, ship after ship striking their colours or attempting to follow Cleopatra's retreat. The strange emptiness of victory settled over me as we watched Antony's flagship turn to follow Cleopatra's retreat. This wasn't triumph over a foreign enemy, it was the final breaking of a man who had once been like a brother in arms. We had fought together at Philippi, shared power for a decade, navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics side by side. Now I watched his sails diminish toward the horizon, a defeated man chasing after a queen who represented everything Roman tradition distrusted. The water around us was littered with wreckage and the struggling forms of men, but the real tragedy felt more personal than political. We had saved Rome from what we framed as Eastern domination, but at the cost of completing the destruction of the Republic's old guard. The last man who could truly challenge my vision for Rome was fleeing, and the victory felt hollow, lonely. The long march to Alexandria that followed was less military campaign and more procession of inevitability. Province after province declared for our side, Antony's supporters melting away as his cause became clearly lost. We moved methodically, securing territories, accepting surrenders, demonstrating that the new order was already replacing the old. The final confrontation felt predetermined. The pieces had been moving toward this conclusion since Actium's waters settled. When we finally reached Egypt, there was little resistance left to offer. The world knew how this story would end. We were simply walking through the final pages. The boy from Velitrae was coming to claim the entire Roman world, and the man who had once dismissed me as insignificant was cornered in the last kingdom not yet under Roman control. The peaceful future I envisioned for Rome was within reach, but first there was one last tragedy to complete. The deaths of Antony and Cleopatra arrived not with dramatic finality, but with a quiet, almost mundane inevitability. Antony fell on his sword, believing false reports of Cleopatra's death, a final tragic misunderstanding between them. Cleopatra followed soon after, choosing the asp's bite over the humiliation of being paraded through Rome in triumph. With their passing, the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries simply ceased to exist. The kingdom became a Roman province, its vast grain reserves and treasures now under my control. The last rival power in the Mediterranean had been absorbed, and the Roman world stretched unbroken from Spain to Syria. But standing there in Alexandria, surrounded by the opulence of a fallen kingdom, I felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, only a profound, echoing loneliness. I was now master of the Roman world, the last man standing from the bloody struggles that had consumed our republic for decades. The boy from Velitrae had outlived all his rivals, outmaneuvered all his enemies, and now held more power than any Roman in history. Yet the weight felt crushing rather than exhilarating. The palaces of Alexandria seemed empty and foreign, their splendour a poor substitute for the simple virtues I remembered from my youth. Every decision I made would now affect millions of people across 3 continents, and there was no one left to share that burden, no one who truly understood what it meant to wield such power alone. The profound question settled over me in those quiet Alexandrian nights. What now? The obvious path would be to follow the pattern of every victorious strongman before me, consolidate personal power, rule through fear and favour, enjoy the spoils of victory until the next ambitious general arose to challenge me. That was how the cycle had always worked. Sulla, then Caesar, then Antony, each temporarily dominating the scene before being overthrown by the next. But I remembered Caesar's fate, the daggers in the Senate house, the betrayal by men he thought were friends. Raw power alone, I realized, is unsustainable. It creates fear and resentment that eventually erupts in violence. The Republic had been bleeding for a century because we kept choosing strongmen over systems, individuals over institutions. The decision took shape slowly, born from equal parts calculation and genuine conviction. I would return power to the Senate and people of Rome, or at least create the convincing appearance of doing so. The genius of this approach wasn't in actually giving up power, but in restructuring it so that it appeared legitimate, traditional and sustainable. I would wrap absolute authority in the respectable cloak of Republican restoration. The people were tired of civil war, exhausted by uncertainty, hungry for stability. They would welcome any solution that promised peace, even if that peace came through carefully disguised autocracy. The lesson of Caesar's assassination was clear. Romans would tolerate immense power if it didn't look like kingship, if it respected the forms and traditions they cherished. So I staged the most careful theatre of my life, the great fiction of restoring the Republic. In a carefully orchestrated ceremony before the Senate, I stood and formally resigned all my extraordinary powers. I offered to return control of the provinces, the armies, the treasury, everything that had been concentrated in my hands during the civil wars. The parchment I held trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the sheer weight of the moment. I could feel the senators holding their breath, wondering if this was genuine or some elaborate test. The silence in the curia was absolute, broken only by the rustle of togas as men shifted uncomfortably. They had expected consolidation of power, not this apparent surrender of it. What happened next was precisely calculated. The Senate, filled with men I had carefully selected or who owed their positions to me, immediately refused my resignation. They begged me to reconsider, to continue serving the state in my current capacity. We went through this dance not once, but repeatedly over the years, each refusal of power making that power seem more legitimate, more earned rather than taken. The optics were perfect. I wasn't seizing control. I was reluctantly accepting responsibility at the people's insistence. This careful choreography made the transition from military dictatorship to constitutional settlement feel organic rather than imposed. The acceptance of a new title, Augustus, the revered one, was the masterstroke that completed this transformation. It carried religious and honorific connotations without the dangerous monarchical implications of rex or dictator. People could call me Augustus without feeling they were betraying republican principles. The title suggested respect earned through service rather than power seized through force. It became the public face of my authority, the name that would appear on monuments and coins, while the mechanics of power operated through more traditional channels. The granting of tribunician power and imperium provided the legal foundation for this new system. Tribunician power made me inviolable and gave me veto authority over any legislation, while the imperium granted supreme military command. These were traditional republican offices and powers, but combined in one person and made permanent rather than annual. The genius was in the packaging. I hadn't created new powers. I had simply accumulated existing ones in a way that respected constitutional forms. The system looked republican because it used republican components, even if the combination was unprecedented. Thus emerged the Principate, a republic in name, an empire in practice. I became the Princeps, the first among equals, a title that suggested leadership rather than domination. The Senate continued to meet, laws continued to be debated, magistrates continued to be elected, but all within boundaries I carefully maintained. The delicate balance required constant attention. Being first among equals without ever saying so, guiding without commanding, leading without appearing to dictate. It was governing through suggestion rather than decree, through influence rather than force. The peace Rome so desperately needed finally had a framework that could sustain it, a system strong enough to prevent chaos but flexible enough to adapt over time. The personal project of restoring Rome's temples and public buildings became my quiet obsession in those early years of peace. You could still see the scars of decades of civil war everywhere. crumbling facades, temples with missing roof tiles, public spaces that had become overgrown with neglect. The physical decay mirrored the moral and political decay we had just overcome. So I began what would become a lifelong commitment, making Rome worthy of its destiny as capital of the world. I started with the temples, restoring 82 that had fallen into disrepair, because a city that neglects its gods neglects its soul. The marble dust filled the air like a promise, the sound of chisels and hammers becoming the music of renewal, hence the famous boast that would follow me through history. I found Rome, a city of bricks, and left it a city of marble. It wasn't just about appearance, though the gleaming white marble certainly transformed the city's character, making it radiant rather than merely functional. The transformation represented something deeper, permanence replacing temporariness, order replacing chaos, beauty replacing mere utility. When people walked through forums paved with marble instead of packed earth, when they worshipped in temples that shone in the sunlight, they felt they were part of something enduring, something worthy of their loyalty and sacrifice. The creation of new aqueducts became another vital project. I remember watching engineers plot the courses of the Aqua Giulia and Aqua Virgo, bringing fresh water from distant springs to neighbourhoods that had suffered from shortages for generations. The graceful arches of the aqueducts marching toward the city became symbols of practical care, government working not for glory but for people's daily needs. Alongside this, the repair of roads connected Rome to its provinces in more than just physical ways. Well-maintained roads meant trade could flow, messages could travel, and the legions could respond quickly to threats. The focus on public works demonstrated that the peace we had achieved would translate into tangible improvements in ordinary lives. The establishment of the city's first fire brigade and police force addressed more immediate dangers. Before this, Rome had relied on private firefighting companies that often arrived too late or demanded payment before acting. I created the vigils, 7 cohorts of firemen who also served as night watchmen, patrolling the streets with buckets and hooks, ready to respond to the constant threat of fire in a city of wooden tenements. Their presence brought a new sense of security, the knowledge that someone was watching through the night, that help was organised rather than haphazard. Order was coming to the city streets not through repression, but through careful planning. Making the city worthy of the empire it commanded became my quiet mission. Every completed project, whether a new library, a restored temple, or a functioning fountain, was a brick in the foundation of the Pax Romana. People could see their taxes at work in ways that improved their daily existence. The transformation was gradual but relentless, year after year of steady progress that slowly erased the physical evidence of Rome's troubled past. The city itself became the strongest argument for the new system, not through grand pronouncements, but through the quiet accumulation of better streets, reliable water, beautiful spaces, and the sense that someone was tending to the common good. While marble could rebuild the city's physical form, the deeper work required restoring Rome's moral foundation. The civil wars had eroded more than buildings. They had weakened the very values that made Romans Roman: discipline, piety, fidelity to family and state. You could see it in the neglect of ancient rituals, in the crumbling of marriage traditions, in the pursuit of personal pleasure over public duty. The legislation I introduced wasn't about controlling private lives, but about healing a society that had lost its moral compass. We needed to rebuild the invisible architecture of trust and responsibility that makes community possible. The laws on marriage, adultery, and childbirth aim to strengthen the family as society's fundamental unit. We offered financial incentives for marriages and children, while imposing penalties on celibacy. Adultery, previously treated as a private matter, became a public crime with serious consequences. These weren't arbitrary restrictions, but attempts to reverse decades of demographic decline and social fragmentation. I understood these measures would be unpopular in some quarters. The elite particularly resisted what they saw as intrusion into private affairs. But the state cannot thrive when its citizens prioritize personal gratification over collective survival. The push for a return to ancient virtues became a quiet campaign in every aspect of public life. We restored religious festivals that had been neglected, rebuilt temples where Romans could practice piety toward the gods. Public ceremonies emphasized discipline and fidelity, not as abstract concepts, but as practical necessities for a functioning society. I commissioned writers and artists to create works that celebrated traditional values, that reminded people what it meant to be Roman beyond mere citizenship. The resistance was predictable. You cannot legislate morality into hearts that have grown cynical, but you can create conditions where virtue becomes easier to practice than vice. The personal effort to model this behaviour in my own household became perhaps the most challenging aspect. My daughter Julia's very public struggles with the marriage laws created a painful contradiction between my public ideals and private reality. Livia and I maintain the appearance of traditional marriage, but the complexities of blended family and political necessity often strained the virtues we publicly championed. The lesson was humbling. Moral reform begins at home, but homes are where our deepest contradictions live. We could create laws, but true change would require generations of consistent example, not just legislation. The creation of a professional salaried civil service became the quiet revolution that made everything else possible. Before this, administration depended on wealthy amateurs serving short terms, men more interested in personal enrichment than efficient governance. I established fixed salaries for magistrates and created permanent positions for tax collectors, record keepers, and infrastructure managers. These weren't temporary appointments, but careers, with promotion based on merit rather than connections. The change meant that whether I was in Rome or the provinces, the machinery of government continued functioning smoothly. Administration became a profession rather than a privilege, creating stability that outlasted any individual's ambition. The reorganization of the provinces addressed one of the Republic's greatest failures, the predatory governance that had fueled resentment and rebellion. I divided the provinces into two categories, those under senatorial control and those under imperial administration. The senatorial provinces were generally peaceful and required minimal military presence, while the imperial provinces housed the legions and required stronger oversight. Most importantly, I fixed salaries for provincial governors, eliminating their need to plunder the locals to recoup election expenses. The end of predatory governors meant communities could prosper without fearing their own administrators, creating loyalty that military force alone could never achieve. The establishment of the Praetorian Guard represented a necessary but dangerous innovation, a double-edged sword of protection that would haunt later emperors. I created 9 cohorts of elite soldiers stationed just outside Rome, their loyalty ensured by higher pay and shorter service terms. Their presence prevented the military coups that had plagued the late Republic, but it also concentrated immense power in the hands of those who controlled them. I carefully balanced this by keeping them outside the city walls and under my direct command, but the precedent worried me. Protection easily becomes domination when the protectors realize their power. The reform of the tax system addressed the chronic instability that came from arbitrary taxation. We conducted the first comprehensive census of the empire, determining not just population but resources and economic capacity. Based on this, I established fixed tax assessments rather than the previous system of competitive tax farming. The publicani, who had often extorted provinces beyond reason, were replaced with salaried officials collecting predetermined amounts. The system became more equitable and efficient, providing predictable revenue while reducing the resentment that had fueled so many provincial revolts. Building a government that could run itself, beyond the lifespan of any one man, became the ultimate goal. The frameworks we created, the civil service, the provincial administration, the tax system, were designed to function whether I was actively governing or not. The genius wasn't in personal control but in creating systems that would endure. The peace we achieved needed institutional foundations, not just charismatic leadership. The administration became the quiet, steady heartbeat of the empire, ensuring that after decades of chaos, Romans could finally experience something they had almost forgotten: predictable, orderly governance that served rather than exploited them. The difficult lessons of the Teutoburg forest arrived like a cold shock to the system, a brutal reminder that peace could not be maintained through ambition alone. When news reached Rome that 3 entire legions had been annihilated in the German forests, Varus and his men ambushed and slaughtered, the city felt that old, familiar fear return. I remember the reports describing the terrain, the clever tactics of Arminius, who'd been our ally until that moment, the way the wilderness itself seemed to turn against our disciplined formations. The loss wasn't just military, it was psychological. We'd grown accustomed to victory, to expansion, as inevitable as sunrise. Teutoburg reminded us that some territories would cost more than they were worth, that not every people could be assimilated, and that sometimes the strongest move was knowing where to stop. The strategic decision that followed was perhaps the most significant of my reign. To solidify the empire's borders at the natural boundaries of the Rhine and Danube rivers, this wasn't retreat, it was realism. I walked through the map room night after night, tracing those river lines with my fingers, understanding that these were defensible frontiers where we could maintain permanent garrisons. Beyond lay dense forests and fierce tribes who knew the land intimately, terrain that negated our advantages of discipline and formation. The decision meant accepting that some conquests weren't worth the blood they would cost, that true strength lay in securing what we had rather than constantly reaching for more. The end of endless expansion marked a fundamental shift in Roman thinking, the beginning of focused consolidation. For centuries our identity had been tied to conquest. Each generation expected to add new territories to the map. Now we would turn inward, making the existing empire prosperous, secure, and well-governed. The energy that had gone into conquest would be channeled into administration, infrastructure, and cultural integration. This was the essence of the Pax Romana, not the peace of exhaustion, but the peace of maturity, the understanding that the greatest empire isn't the largest, but the most stable and well-ordered. The army transformed accordingly from an instrument of conquest to one of defence. The legions became guardians of the frontiers rather than spearheads of expansion. We built permanent forts along the Rhine and Danube, stone and timber replacements for the temporary marching camps of previous generations. Soldiers now served longer terms at these posts, becoming familiar with the local terrain and patterns of life. Their role shifted from conquering new lands to protecting the peace within established borders, from bringing civilization to outsiders, to preserving it for those already within the empire. The change required adjustments in training, equipment, and mentality, but it created the stability that would define the next 2 centuries. The establishment of the permanent professional legions at the frontiers completed this transformation. These weren't temporary forces raised for specific campaigns, but standing institutions with their own traditions, histories, and identities. They became communities as much as military units, with veterans often settling near their posts after service, creating Romanized zones along the borderlands. The system created a defensive depth that mobile armies never could. Each legion knew its sector intimately, could recognize unusual movements, and could respond quickly to threats. The borders became not just lines on a map, but living, defended spaces where Roman peace met the outside world, maintained by soldiers who understood that their duty wasn't to expand the empire, but to protect the peace within it. The conscious patronage of poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid was never simply about supporting the arts. It was about giving Rome a new language for understanding itself. After decades of civil war, we needed more than just peace. We needed a story that could bind our wounds and give meaning to our suffering. I invited these brilliant minds to my home on the Palatine, not as a patron condescending to artists, but as a fellow citizen seeking their help in the greatest project of all, healing Rome's soul. We would sit for hours discussing philosophy, history, and what it meant to be Roman in this new age. They understood that culture isn't decoration, it's the foundation upon which civilizations stand or fall. Virgil's Aeneid became the heart of this cultural project, creating a national epic that tied Rome's destiny directly to the gods themselves. The poem wasn't just literature, it was political theology woven into verse. It gave us a founding myth that connected my reign to the very origins of Rome, suggesting that everything from Aeneas's flight from Troy to the peace I established was part of a divine plan. Virgil worked on it for years, often reading drafts to me in the evenings, his quiet voice giving rhythm to Rome's deepest aspirations. The poem provided what battles and laws never could, a sense of shared destiny, a story that made Romans feel they were part of something eternal and purposeful. The use of art and literature to promote the new era of peace and prosperity was always subtle, never crude propaganda. When Horace wrote his odes celebrating the return of peace, they resonated because they captured genuine relief, not manufactured enthusiasm. The poets understood that the best way to celebrate this new age was to show its fruits. Children growing up without knowing war, farmers tending unburnt fields, merchants travelling safe roads. Their work made the Pax Romana feel tangible and precious, something worth preserving through collective effort. Art became the gentle voice that reminded Romans what they had gained after so much loss. The building of theatres and libraries, the promotion of public games, all served as physical manifestations of this cultural renewal. The Theatre of Marcellus, named for my nephew, wasn't just an entertainment venue. It was a statement that Rome now had leisure for the arts, that we valued more than just military glory. The libraries on the Palatine made Greek and Latin literature accessible to any citizen who could read, creating common cultural touchstones across social classes. Even the public games evolved from purely military displays to include theatrical performances, poetry readings, and artistic competitions. Culture became the glue that would bind our diverse empire together, giving millions of people from Spain to Syria a shared sense of what it meant to be part of Roman civilization. The struggles with illness were my constant, invisible companion through all those years of building peace. My body was never particularly strong, prone to fevers that would lay me low for weeks, a chest that tightened with every change of season, joints that ached with the dampness that settled over Rome. While others saw the powerful ruler, I knew the private reality. The nights spent sweating through fevers, the mornings when simply rising required immense effort. The physical weakness felt like a cruel joke. The man responsible for the world's greatest empire could be felled by a common chill. I learned to govern from my bed when necessary, to conserve energy for the moments that truly mattered, to surround myself with people like Agrippa, who could act when my body failed me. The profound grief of outliving my chosen heirs became the deepest wound of my private life. Marcellus, my nephew and son-in-law, possessed everything Rome needed in a successor: intelligence, charm, military aptitude, and the bloodline that mattered. His death at just 19 felt like watching the future itself perish. Then Gaius and Lucius, the grandsons I had raised as my own, both taken by illness in their young manhood. The irony was almost unbearable. I could secure peace for millions, but I couldn't protect the boys I loved most. The palace that echoed with the footsteps of officials and diplomats felt emptier without their laughter, their arguments, their promise. Each loss was a private earthquake that shook the foundations of everything I was building. The complex relationship with my daughter Julia remains the most painful chapter of my family story. Her brilliance and charm reminded me so much of her mother, my beloved Scribonia. But her rebellion against the moral laws I championed created an impossible conflict. I exiled her not out of anger, but out of terrible necessity. The father who loved her had to yield to the ruler who couldn't tolerate the public contradiction of his reforms. The letters she sent from her island prison were filled with such intelligence and wit, such understanding of the position I was in, and yet such profound loneliness. We were trapped in our roles: the reformer who couldn't pardon his own daughter, the daughter who couldn't forgive her father's public virtue. The reliance on my wife, Livia, became the steady foundation that made everything else possible. She was more than a wife. She was a partner in a rule, if not in title, her political instincts often sharper than my own. In the evenings, after the courtiers and senators had departed, we would walk through the palace gardens discussing the day's events, her observations about who could be trusted, which alliances were forming, what the mood of the city truly was. She never sought credit for her counsel, understanding that power works best when some hands remain unseen. Her calm presence through decades of challenge was the private anchor that kept me from being swept away by the currents of power. The isolation that comes with ultimate responsibility, the loneliness of command, was the price I paid most willingly yet felt most deeply. There were decisions I couldn't share, fears I couldn't voice, calculations that would have horrified even those closest to me. The weight of sending men to their deaths, of ordering actions that were necessary but brutal, of balancing countless lives against each other, these burdens were mine alone to carry. The boy from Velitrae who had known simple friendships and family warmth now moved through crowds of people yet was utterly alone. The peace I gave Rome required this solitude, this distance from ordinary human connection. The marble halls of the palace were beautiful, but they echoed with the silence that comes when you can no longer be simply human. The endless, delicate dance of preparing a successor without naming a king became the quiet obsession of my later years. You understand the paradox. I had built a system that concentrated immense power while maintaining the fiction of Republican restoration. But that same system now required careful transition rather than simple inheritance. The question haunted my nights: how to pass this carefully constructed authority to someone capable without creating the monarchy I had spent my life avoiding. Every move was scrutinized, every favour to a potential heir analysed for meaning. The Senate watched, the people wondered, and I navigated this most dangerous of political passages with the knowledge that one misstep could unravel decades of work. The adoption of Tiberius represented a practical solution, though not the one my heart had desired. He was a capable but difficult man, an excellent general, administratively competent, yet lacking the warmth or charm that might have made the transition smoother. After losing Marcellus, then Gaius and Lucius, the choices narrowed to what was possible rather than what was ideal. Tiberius understood power, respected institutions, and possessed the military credentials to command the army's loyalty. His dour nature might even serve him well. The Romans had grown weary of charismatic leaders who promised miracles. Perhaps they would appreciate steady, if unspectacular, competence. The transfer of power happened layer by layer, a gradual shifting of responsibilities designed to ensure smooth transition. I began granting Tiberius tribunician power years before my death, allowing him to share in governance while I remained available for guidance. The legions were introduced to him as their future commander. The provinces learned to respect his authority. The Senate grew accustomed to seeing us rule together. This careful choreography aimed to make the eventual transfer feel like natural progression rather than disruptive change. The system needed to absorb the new leader gradually, like a tree accepting a graft, so that when the time came, the empire would barely notice the difference. The fear that it would all unravel upon my death never truly left me, that the chaos would return, that the delicate balance would collapse into another century of civil war. I had seen how quickly institutions could fail when personal ambition overwhelmed collective good. The peace felt fragile despite its apparent strength, like marble that could still fracture along hidden fault lines. Some nights I would walk through the palace imagining the sounds of conflict returning, the marching boots, the alarm bells, the panicked whispers. The work of a lifetime could vanish in a season if the wrong hands seized the mechanisms I had created. Yet the hope remained that the system would be stronger than the individual, that the frameworks of administration, the professional military, the settled succession would create stability that outlasted any one ruler. The true test of my life's work wouldn't be how well I governed, but how well Rome governed itself after I was gone. If the peace could transition to new leadership without bloodshed, if the institutions could function without my guidance, then the transformation would be complete. The boy from Velitrae would have given Rome not just temporary peace, but the possibility of enduring stability. In my final years, I began composing the account of my achievements, the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, to be engraved on bronze pillars before my mausoleum after my death. This wasn't meant as boastful memorial, but as careful justification, a record for the Roman people explaining the power I had wielded and why it was necessary. You might imagine an old man sitting in his study, surrounded by scrolls and memories, trying to make sense of a lifetime's work. The document carefully listed everything. The temples restored, the wars concluded, the gifts to the treasury and people, the political offices held and refused. Each entry served a purpose, not to glorify myself, but to demonstrate that every action had been taken for the benefit of Rome, never for personal aggrandizement. The framing was crucial. This was an explanation of service to the state, not a celebration of personal triumph. I documented how I had transferred the state from my power to the control of the Senate and people of Rome, while carefully omitting that the transfer was more theatrical than substantive. The achievements were presented as gifts to the people, not conquests for myself. The careful wording made absolute power appear as reluctant duty accepted for the common good. This final piece of propaganda was designed to secure my legacy by presenting the Principate not as revolution but as restoration, not as autocracy but as service. The marble and bronze would outlive me, carrying this carefully crafted story to future generations, who would know neither the chaos I inherited nor the difficult choices required to end it. The quiet that had settled over the Mediterranean felt like a miracle after so many decades of war. You could almost hear the difference in the rhythm of daily life, the gentle lapping of waves against merchant ships instead of war galleys, the the distant sounds of market chatter in port cities rather than military commands. The Pax Romana wasn't just the absence of conflict, it was the presence of something new and precious. For the first time in living memory, a trader in Hispania could plan a voyage to Syria knowing the seas would be clear of pirates, that the ports would be open, that his goods would reach their destination. This safety created a web of connection stretching across the known world, binding diverse cultures through commerce and communication. The flow of goods and ideas across provinces became the lifeblood of this new peace. Egyptian grain fed Rome's population, Spanish silver minted our coins, Greek philosophy educated our elite, and Gallic horses carried our messengers. The roads I had repaired and expanded now carried more than soldiers. They carried merchants, scholars, families visiting relatives, officials administering justice. You could stand on the Appian Way and watch the world moving in peaceful pursuit of ordinary life. The Mediterranean became what it was always meant to be, not a barrier separating nations, but a bridge connecting them, a Roman lake where ideas crossed as easily as trade goods. Generations would now grow up knowing war only as a story their grandparents told, a distant nightmare from another time. Children in Gaul would play with wooden swords without fearing real legionaries marching through their villages. Farmers in Greece would tend olive groves that hadn't been burned by passing armies. Mothers in Syria would raise their sons without dreading the conscription notices that had torn families apart for centuries. This was the profound gift of peace, not just safety, but the ability to imagine a future, to plant crops that would be harvested years later, to build homes that would shelter generations, to live without the constant shadow of violence. The realization settled upon me gradually that this peace, not conquest, was my greatest achievement. The battles I had won, the territories I had secured, these were means to an end, not the end itself. The true monument wasn't in the triumphal arches celebrating military victories, but in the silent, everyday security that allowed ordinary people to live extraordinary lives. A scholar in Alexandria could pursue knowledge without fearing the library would burn. A craftsman in Rome could master his trade knowing his workshop wouldn't be looted. The peace created space for human potential to flourish in ways that constant warfare had always stifled. The empire became a shared project, a common civilization that respected local traditions while creating something larger than any single culture. A citizen in Carthage could feel Roman while preserving Punic customs. A farmer in Britain could benefit from Roman roads and security while maintaining ancestral farming methods. This wasn't assimilation, but integration, a tapestry of diverse threads woven together by the common experience of peace and orderly government. The world felt both larger and smaller simultaneously, larger in its possibilities, smaller in its connections, and at the centre of it all was this remarkable, fragile, precious peace that had cost so much to achieve and required constant vigilance to maintain. But the true measure of peace wasn't in grand statistics or military victories. It was in the quiet rhythms of daily life that returned to 1,000 towns across the empire. You could see it in the farmer tending his field without that constant fear of soldiers requisitioning his crop for some distant campaign. He could plant in spring knowing he'd be the one harvesting in autumn, that his family would eat what they grew, that his labour would benefit his children rather than feed some general's ambition. That simple certainty, that your work would not be stolen by the needs of war, changed everything about how people lived their lives. The merchant planning a voyage could now calculate risks based on weather and markets rather than pirates and warring factions. He could invest in larger ships, hire more crew, venture to more distant ports, all because the seas were finally safe. This wasn't just about profit. It was about the ability to dream bigger, to build businesses that could span generations rather than being constantly disrupted by conflict. The economic stability that followed wasn't an abstract concept. It was fathers being able to provide for their families, communities being able to plan for their future, ordinary people being able to trust that tomorrow would resemble today. The simple, profound luxury of safety became the foundation upon which everything else was built. Parents could watch their children play in the streets without fearing they might be caught in sudden violence. Families could gather for meals without listening for alarm bells. Communities could invest in temples and schools and public baths, knowing these structures would still be standing years later. This predictability, this blessed ordinariness, was what Romans had been fighting for across generations of civil war. Not glory, not conquest, but the right to live their lives without constant interruption by someone else's ambition. The peace that allowed ordinary people to live extraordinary lives was perhaps the greatest miracle of all. That baker's son who became a renowned architect because he could apprentice safely in Alexandria. That farmer's daughter who learned to read because the village now had a school. That craftsman who perfected his technique over decades because his workshop wasn't destroyed in some pointless conflict. The Pax Romana wasn't about my achievements. It was about creating the conditions where millions of unknown Romans could achieve their own potential. The quiet dignity of ordinary life, lived without fear, was the true monument to those difficult years of struggle. The room felt familiar in a way that unsettled me. This was the same house in Nola where my father had drawn his last breath decades earlier. The afternoon light slanted through the window, catching dust motes dancing in the air like forgotten memories. I could feel the weight of years settling in my bones, a tiredness that went deeper than sleep could remedy. They had brought me here hoping the country air might revive me, but some journeys only move in one direction. The physicians came and went with their potions and poultices, their faces increasingly grim. Livia stayed close, her presence a quiet anchor in the drifting hours. The work of a lifetime stretched behind me like a completed tapestry, every thread in place, every pattern finished. Those gathered around my bed included old friends, advisors, even Tiberius looking more solemn than usual. I asked them the question that had been circling in my mind: have I played my part well in this comedy of life? The words came out softer than I intended, barely more than a whisper. They assured me I had, of course. What else could they say? But the question wasn't really for them. It was the final accounting a man makes with himself when the audience has faded away and only truth remains. The boy from Velletri had indeed found Rome of brick and left it marble, but the transformation went deeper than stone. It was in the quiet that had settled over 1,000 cities, the safety that allowed ordinary people to dream ordinary dreams. My hope as the light began to fade was that the marble would last, that the peace would hold beyond my breathing. Systems are fragile things. They need care and feeding, the constant attention of people who understand that order is never permanent, only maintained. I thought of the roads stretching to every province, the aqueducts bringing fresh water, the legions standing watch at the frontiers. They would continue their work without me, as they should. The mechanisms were in place, the succession settled as well as any mortal could arrange. The work felt complete, the long task finished. There was a strange peace in that realization, a letting go of responsibility that I hadn't known was possible. The eyes closed, not in defeat, but in acceptance. The story had been told, and now it was time for silence. Did I save the Republic or bury it? The question still lingers like morning mist over the Tiber, never quite dissipating. You could argue it both ways, that I preserved its forms while transforming its substance, that I gave Rome stability at the cost of liberty. But the peace I brought lasted 2 centuries, generations living without the constant shadow of civil war. The system outlived me, because it wasn't built on my personality but on structures that could endure. The professional army, the civil service, the settled succession. The Pax Romana was my answer to the chaos I inherited, and for a time it held. The story ends here, but the peace, for a time, endured. If you'd like to walk through more quiet history, consider subscribing for another evening's reflection. The quiet moments are when the ghosts of the past would visit most persistently, not as dramatic apparitions, but as sudden memories that would surface without warning. The face of a senator I'd condemned during the proscriptions, the sound of a mother weeping for her executed son, the particular way the light fell on the Tiber the morning we posted the death lists. These weren't moments of grand remorse, but small, sharp regrets that would catch in the throat like swallowed tears. You carry such memories not as a single burden, but as countless small weights that accumulate over decades, each one a life altered by your decisions, a family changed forever by necessities of state. Remembering faces from the proscriptions became a particular kind of haunting. I could be reviewing tax reports or listening to a poet recite, and suddenly I'd see a man's face as he read his name on the list. That moment of disbelief turning to terror, the way his eyes would dart around the forum looking for friends who were already turning away. The necessary sacrifices we told ourselves were for Rome's stability had names, had families, had lives that ended because we needed their wealth to fund our war. The calculation never leaves you. How many lives is peace worth? How much blood must be spilled to stop the bleeding of a nation? The arithmetic of power always comes with remainders, these souls that don't fit neatly into the columns of justification. The constant calculation became a silent companion to every decision. Was the peace worth the blood spilled? When I walked through the rebuilt forum, seeing children play where men had once been executed, watching merchants trade where property had been confiscated, I could almost believe the balance was justified. The comfort came in those small moments. A father lifting his daughter to see a new statue, an old woman selling flowers without fear of soldiers dispersing the market, the ordinary sounds of a city going about its business without looking over its shoulder. These were the weights on the other side of the scale, the lives preserved and improved that somehow had to balance against the lives destroyed. The comfort found in seeing children play safely in the forum became my private redemption, their laughter echoing off marble walls that had once echoed with the sounds of rioting and violence. This was the evidence that the terrible choices might have been worth making. They would never know the world I had inherited, never lie awake listening for the sounds of street fighting, never have their education interrupted by civil war. That generation would judge my reign not by its difficult beginnings, but by the world they inherited, and for them, peace would simply be the natural state of things, something they could take for granted rather than something fought for with other men's blood. The balance between remorse and resolve that every ruler must carry is the true burden of power. You cannot lead a nation through transformation without breaking some things that cannot be mended, without making choices that will haunt your quiet moments. The peace of millions required the suffering of thousands. The stability of the state demanded the sacrifice of individuals. This is the arithmetic they never teach you when you're a boy studying in Velitrae. That governance is often the art of choosing which tragedies to prevent and which to permit. The ghosts don't accuse, they simply remind you that every decision has costs, and that true leadership means being willing to carry those costs yourself so your people don't have to. The change in Rome's soundscape told the story better than any historian ever could. Where there had once been the clashing of steel and the midnight alarms signalling another crisis. Now there was the steady hum of market chatter, the laughter of children playing where soldiers once marched, the comfortable noise of a city going about its peaceful business. You could stand in the forum at noon and hear the ordinary music of civilization, merchants haggling, poets reciting, craftsmen tapping at their work. The absence of tension felt like a physical presence, a quiet that wasn't empty but full of life lived without fear. The rhythm of hammers rebuilding rather than forging weapons became the new soundtrack of the Empire. I would wake to that sound each morning, not the urgent pounding of armories preparing for battle, but the steady, purposeful work of construction. Stonemasons shaping marble for temples, carpenters framing new public buildings, engineers directing aqueduct repairs. These were the sounds of creation replacing destruction. The very air smelled of sawdust and fresh mortar instead of smoke and fear. You could close your eyes and hear Rome healing itself, stone by stone, beam by beam, becoming something worthy of its people. The absence of midnight alarms, the presence of ordinary noise. This was the true measure of our progress. No more sudden shouts in the darkness, no more running footsteps signalling another political crisis, no more anxious whispers about which houses were being searched. Instead, the night brought its own peaceful sounds, the gentle clatter of the vigiles making their rounds, the distant singing of late-night revellers, the occasional cart delivering goods to morning markets. The darkness had been returned to its proper purpose, rest, not fear. Romans could sleep through the night knowing their world wouldn't change before dawn. The music in theatres replacing the wails of mourning women marked perhaps the most profound transformation. Where mothers had once gathered to grieve sons lost in endless civil wars, now audiences gathered to hear comedies and tragedies performed for pleasure. The arts flourished because people finally had the emotional space for them. When you're not constantly worrying about survival, you can appreciate beauty, you can engage with ideas, you can simply enjoy being entertained. The sound of lyres and flutes drifting from performance spaces became the anthem of a people who had rediscovered how to live rather than just endure. Learning to appreciate silence without fearing what it might conceal was the final gift of peace. In the early years, quiet had always felt ominous. The calm before another storm, the moment when conspiracies were being hatched. But gradually we all learned that silence could simply be silence. The pause between conversations, the still of early morning, the quiet of a library. These became moments to cherish, rather than dread. The peace I had worked for wasn't just in treaties and laws. It was in this fundamental change in how Romans experienced their world, in the simple-to-hear ordinary life without listening for danger. The daily routine of administration became the quiet heartbeat of the empire, the paperwork of peace that followed the drums of war. Each morning began with scrolls and correspondence, reports from provincial governors, petitions from citizens, military dispatches from the frontiers. The weight wasn't in the parchment itself, but in the lives affected by every decision. You learn to read between the lines of these documents, to sense the anxiety in a governor's overly formal report, to recognize the hidden crisis in a request for additional funds. Governing an empire means listening to its quietest voices, hearing the concerns that never make it into official histories. The careful selection of provincial governors became one of my most crucial responsibilities, watching constantly for the dangerous spark of ambition. I looked for men who understood administration as service rather than opportunity, who saw their provinces as communities to nurture rather than resources to exploit. The interviews took place in my study, away from the performative politics of the Senate floor. I'd watch their eyes as we discussed tax collection, infrastructure projects, treatment of local populations. The best candidates spoke about people rather than percentages, about long-term stability rather than short-term gains. They understood that good governance is mostly invisible. It's the crises that don't happen, the revolts that never begin. The balance between central control and local autonomy required constant adjustment, like tuning a complex instrument. Too much control from Rome stifled initiative and bred resentment. Too little risked corruption and instability. We established general principles: fair taxation, respect for local customs, maintenance of infrastructure, but allowed provinces flexibility in implementation. A governor in Gaul faced different challenges than his counterpart in Syria, and the system had to accommodate those differences while maintaining overall coherence. The art was in finding that sweet spot where local knowledge met imperial oversight, where diversity strengthened unity rather than threatening it. The endless correspondence that kept the empire connected filled my days with the scratch of stylus on wax tablet. Letters to governors, instructions to military commanders, responses to citizen petitions, each required careful phrasing that balanced authority with respect. The language of power works best when it speaks softly, when it suggests rather than commands, when it makes compliance feel like partnership rather than submission. I learned to write in the morning when my mind was clearest, often dictating to secretaries while walking in the gardens, finding that physical movement helped organize thoughts about the empire's countless moving parts. The satisfaction came not from dramatic victories, but from solving problems before they became crises. The tax dispute settled fairly, the infrastructure project completed on schedule, the border tension diffused through diplomacy. These quiet successes left no monuments, inspired no poets, but they were the true foundation of the Pax Romana. The art of governing, I discovered, is mostly about preventing disasters rather than creating triumphs. It's the patient, unglamorous work of maintenance and adjustment, of listening and responding, of building systems that function so smoothly that most people never need to think about how they work. Watching my grandchildren grow up in a world I created brought both profound joy and acute anxiety. They would never know the Rome of my youth, the constant fear, the sudden violence, the uncertainty that shadowed every tomorrow. Their childhoods unfolded in marble halls and peaceful gardens, their laughter echoing through spaces where conspiracies once whispered. They took stability for granted, this precious gift that had cost so much to secure. Yet this very safety created its own dilemma: how to prepare them for leadership without the hardening experiences that had shaped my generation. The peace I gave them was their inheritance, but also their challenge. Could they maintain what they had never fought to earn? The painful lessons of succession unfolded like a tragedy written by some cruel playwright. Marcellus, with his brilliant mind and natural leadership, struck down before he could blossom. Then Gaius and Lucius, the boys I had raised from childhood, their promising lives extinguished just as they entered manhood. Each loss felt like watching the future itself perish, the careful plans for continuity crumbling to dust. The irony was almost unbearable. I could secure peace for millions across 3 continents, but I couldn't protect the young men I loved most. The palace that bustled with officials and ambassadors felt emptier without their energy, their arguments, their boundless potential. Livia's steady presence through decades of challenge became the anchor that held our family, and indeed the empire, together. She was more than a wife. She was my most trusted advisor, her political instincts often sharper than those of my most experienced senators. In the evenings, after the courtiers had departed, we would walk through the palace gardens discussing everything from military deployments to family matters. She never sought public credit. understanding that the most effective power often works unseen. Her calm judgment through crisis after crisis, her ability to see the human dimension of every decision, made her the true partner in everything I built. The irony of creating stability for millions while my own house struggled never escaped me. I could give the empire predictable government, secure borders, and economic prosperity, but I couldn't make my daughter Julia happy within the moral framework I championed. I couldn't force Tiberius to develop the warmth that might have made him more beloved. The personal and the political became hopelessly entangled. The father who wanted his family's happiness often conflicted with the ruler who needed certain standards maintained. The very virtues I promoted for Rome, piety, discipline, fidelity, sometimes felt like chains binding those I loved most. The hope that future generations would understand the sacrifices made sustained me through the most difficult choices. Perhaps they would look back and see not just the marble buildings and peaceful borders, but the terrible calculations behind them. Maybe they would understand that saving a republic sometimes requires actions that contradict its ideals, that building lasting peace often begins with necessary violence. The children playing safely in the forum, the merchants planning voyages without fear of piracy, the farmers planting crops they would actually harvest. These were the living justification for every difficult decision. If they could enjoy their lives without understanding the cost, perhaps that was the greatest success of all. 40 years of watching Rome change with the seasons taught me that true peace reveals itself in nature's steady rhythms rather than political drama. You notice it first in the spring planting. Farmers put in seeds in peaceful fields that once grew only for armies marching through. Their movements are slow, deliberate, filled with the certainty that they'll be there to harvest what they plant. No more watching crops trampled by legions. No more grain requisitioned for campaigns that might last years. The earth itself seems to remember the change, yielding more abundantly when not soaked with the blood of competing armies. Summer festivals transformed under the peace, celebrating harvest and community rather than military triumphs. Where we once watched parades of captured enemies and spoils of war, now we see children racing through streets decorated with flowers, farmers displaying their finest produce, artisans demonstrating their crafts. The air smells of roasting grains and baking bread instead of sweat and fear. These celebrations feel different, not about conquering others, but about enjoying the fruits of our collective labour. The laughter sounds lighter, unburdened by the memory of recent losses. Autumn harvests now fill public granaries instead of military camps, a change that means more than just full stomachs. You can see the difference in people's faces at the markets. No more frantic hoarding before winter, no more anxiety about whether supplies will last until spring. The granaries stand as physical manifestations of the peace, their overflowing contents guaranteeing that no Roman will starve while the empire prospers. This security allows planning, investment, the kind of long-term thinking that civil war always destroys. Winter nights feel different too. Families gather around hearths warmed by the certainty of spring's return. Parents tell stories not of battles and heroes, but of family history and local legends. The season becomes a time of reflection rather than survival, of interior life rather than constant vigilance. You can feel the change in the quality of silence after snowfall. It's peaceful, not ominous. The knowledge that spring will indeed come, that the cycle will continue uninterrupted, becomes the greatest luxury after decades of uncertainty. These seasonal rhythms, repeating year after year without interruption, slowly heal the psychological wounds that battles and treaties cannot touch. Outliving friends, rivals, and even my own reputation became the strange burden of those final years. The men I'd fought alongside at Philippi, the senators who'd challenged me in my youth, the poets who'd given voice to our new era. One by one they departed, leaving me increasingly alone with my memories. The world kept changing, but I remained, becoming a living institution rather than a person. Young senators would approach me with respectful curiosity, their knowledge of the civil wars coming from history texts rather than lived experience. They only knew the world I had made, not the broken republic I had inherited, and sometimes I caught them studying me as if I were already a statue in the forum. The loneliness of being the last one who remembered the old republic settled deep in my bones. When discussions turned to constitutional matters, I was the only one in the room who had actually served under the old system, who remembered how the Senate functioned before the decades of crisis. My perspectives felt increasingly like artifacts from another age, valuable for historical context, but somehow disconnected from the practical realities of governing the empire we'd built. The comfort came in knowing the system would continue without me. The professional administration, the settled succession, the mechanisms of peace that had become self-sustaining. My own relevance mattered less than Rome's continued stability. If you appreciate these quiet reflections on history, consider subscribing for more stories that help you unwind while exploring the past. The work continues even when the workers change. You notice it first in the quality of light, how sunlight catches differently on marble than on brick, creating a luminous glow throughout the city where once there was only practical functionality. The transformation wasn't merely aesthetic, it was psychological. When citizens walk through forums paved with gleaming stone instead of packed earth, when they conduct business in basilicas that feel permanent rather than temporary, something shifts in their perception of what Rome represents. The marble buildings reflected the solidity of the new order we were building, not just structures, but statements in stone about endurance, stability, and the belief that this peace would last beyond any single generation. Every arch, temple, and public space carried deliberate symbolism. The Arch of Augustus near the Forum wasn't just a monument to military victories. It marked the point where the sacred boundary of the city expanded, physically demonstrating that Rome was growing in both territory and ambition. The Temple of Caesar on the opposite side of the Forum sanctified the place of his cremation, turning a site of political murder into one of religious veneration. These weren't random constructions. They were carefully placed elements in a new civic language written in marble and mortar, teaching Romans how to understand their transformed world through its physical environment. Designing Rome as a physical manifestation of stability became my quiet obsession. I wanted citizens to feel the peace in their bones when they walked through their city, to see order in the straight lines of new colonnades, to feel security in the solidity of repaired city walls, to experience beauty as a daily reality rather than a distant luxury. The city itself became the strongest argument for the new system, its improving landscape demonstrating that someone was tending to the common good, that taxes were being translated into tangible improvements in daily life. You can govern through laws and speeches, but you persuade through the environment people inhabit every day. The careful preservation of old structures alongside the new created a powerful continuity. We didn't tear down the Republican temples to build imperial ones. We restored them, often inscribing my name alongside the original dedicators. This visual dialogue between old and new reassured Romans that we weren't erasing the past but building upon it. The message was subtle but consistent. The peace we enjoyed wasn't a break from tradition, but its fulfillment. The architecture became a physical conversation across generations, with each era respecting what came before while adding its own voice to Rome's ongoing story. Creating beauty as an antidote to past brutality felt like the most important work of those middle years. After decades of civil war, Romans had become accustomed to visual reminders of conflict, damaged buildings, neglected spaces, the general atmosphere of decay that follows prolonged crisis. The new construction provided a visual language of healing, showing that we were building rather than destroying, creating rather than consuming. The beauty wasn't frivolous, it was therapeutic, helping to heal the psychological wounds that treaties and laws couldn't reach. When people live surrounded by order and beauty, they begin to expect it from their institutions and leaders as well. The daily walk through the city became my most cherished ritual, a way to stay connected to the ordinary life unfolding beyond palace walls. I would leave the Palatine in simple attire, just another citizen moving through Rome's awakening streets. The morning air carried the scent of baking bread from neighbourhood ovens and the damp stone smell of recently cleaned pavements. You notice things on foot that you miss from a litter, the shopkeeper arranging his wares with careful pride, the children racing to school, the old men already debating in the forum. These small moments reminded me daily what we were preserving, not an abstract concept of empire, but the simple human dignity of predictable life. The simple meals that reminded me of my childhood in Velitrae kept me grounded when power threatened to distort perspective. I preferred plain bread, olive oil, fresh cheese, and seasonal fruits, the same foods I'd eaten growing up. Dining alone or with Livia, we would often eat from simple terracotta rather than silver plates. There's a truth that resides in simplicity that elaborate banquets often obscure. The taste of a perfectly ripe fig or the crunch of bread still warm from the oven connects you to essential things. The seasons, the earth, the labour of farmers who make such moments possible. Luxury distances you from reality. Simplicity reminds you of what matters. The evening review of the day's decisions with Livia became our private council, often more productive than any meeting with senators. We would walk in the palace gardens as dusk settled, the evening air cool after Rome's heat. She had an uncanny ability to see the human dimension of every policy, how a tax change would affect small merchants, which family might be offended by an appointment, what rumour might sprout from a particular decision. Her perspective balanced my sometimes overly administrative view of governance. These walks weren't just about governing better, they were about staying human while wielding power that constantly tempts you to forget. The quiet moments of reading Greek philosophy in my library provided the intellectual anchor that political life constantly threatened to loosen. In the evening stillness, with only the soft sound of turning parchment, I could reconnect with the questions that matter. Not how to govern, but why. The Stoics particularly resonated with their emphasis on duty, discipline, and accepting what cannot be changed. Their words reminded me that power is temporary, but character endures. These hours of study weren't escape from responsibility, but preparation for it, a way to ensure that the man making decisions hadn't been entirely consumed by the title he carried. Maintaining connection to the man beneath the title required constant vigilance. Power doesn't just change how others see you, it changes how you see yourself. The rituals, the walks, the simple meals, the evening reflections were defences against this transformation. They reminded me that before I was Augustus, I was Gaius Octavius from Velitrae, and that the boy's values were worth preserving in the man. The true challenge of leadership isn't wielding power, but remaining yourself while doing so. These daily practices were my way of remembering that the peace we built was ultimately for real people, living real lives, not for the glory of any one ruler. What 40 years of peace meant for ordinary Romans wasn't measured in grand monuments or military triumphs, but in the quiet accumulation of small certainties. You notice it first in the faces of children who've never known the sound of alarm bells in the night. Their laughter comes easier. Their play lacks that subtle tension that characterized my own youth. Generations grew up without knowing civil war as anything but a story their grandparents told, a distant nightmare from another time. This was the profound gift we gave them. Not just safety, but the ability to imagine futures that stretched beyond the next harvest or military campaign. They could apprentice in trades knowing their workshops would still stand in 5 years, marry with confidence that their children would grow up in stability, build lives on foundations that wouldn't suddenly collapse beneath them. The accumulation of small improvements over decades created a Rome that felt fundamentally different from the city I'd inherited. Where there had been crumbling infrastructure and neglected public spaces, now there were maintained roads, functioning fountains, and temples that gleamed in the sunlight. This steady progress wasn't dramatic, but it was relentless, year after year of quiet investment in ordinary life. The slow healing of Rome's psychological wounds happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, as citizens grew accustomed to peace as their normal state, rather than a temporary reprieve between conflicts. The very rhythm of life changed from reactive survival to purposeful building. The privilege of watching stability become normal was perhaps the greatest reward of those long years. You could see it in the way people planned their lives. The merchant investing in a larger ship because piracy was controlled. The farmer planting orchards that would take years to mature. The parents saving for children's educations they might not complete for a decade. This ability to think beyond immediate concerns, to make investments in futures that felt secure, transformed Roman society at its very foundation. The peace wasn't just the absence of war, it was the presence of possibility, the space for ordinary people to dream ordinary dreams that previous generations couldn't afford to entertain. Not by battles won, but by battles never fought. That was the true measure of our success. The empty battlefields where legions never marched, the peaceful borders where farmers tended crops instead of watching for invaders, the seas where merchants sailed without naval escorts. These absences spoke louder than any triumphal arch. The real victory wasn't in the conflicts we survived, but in the conflicts we prevented through strength so undeniable it made war unnecessary. You could stand on the Rhine and feel the quiet, not the quiet of weakness, but of power so complete it needed no demonstration. Not by territories conquered, but by territories prospering. That was the enduring legacy. I walked through Gaul decades after conquest and saw not subjugation but transformation. Roman towns with forums and baths, local farmers exporting goods to distant provinces, children learning Latin alongside their native tongue. The true expansion wasn't measured in miles added to the map, but in the quality of life improved within existing borders. An empire's greatness lies not in its extent, but in how well it serves those within its care. Not by power accumulated, but by power responsibly exercised. This was the delicate balance we maintained. The authority I wielded could have built personal glory, but instead built public good. The resources that might have constructed lavish palaces instead constructed aqueducts and roads. The loyalty of legions that could have conquered new territories instead protected existing peace. True strength isn't what you take, but what you give back. The stability that allows ordinary people to thrive without constantly fearing the whims of power. Not by years lived, but by peace secured. This was the final accounting that mattered. My life would be measured not by its length, but by what endured beyond it. The systems that would continue functioning, the institutions that would maintain order, the generations that would know security as their birthright. The true monument wasn't in stone or marble, but in the quiet certainty that had settled over the Mediterranean world, the knowledge that tomorrow would resemble today, that effort would be rewarded, that life could be lived without looking over one's shoulder. The true monument was this: a world where Romans could simply live, not just survive, not merely endure, but live, with dignity, with purpose, with the freedom to pursue ordinary happiness. The farmer tending his vineyard, the scholar in his library, the mother raising her children, the merchant planning his voyage. These were the living testaments to our work. Their quiet routines, their modest dreams, their uninterrupted lives. This was the peace we fought for. Not glorious, not dramatic, but profound in its simplicity. The greatest achievement was making extraordinary peace feel ordinary. And so, my tale reaches its end. I have walked from the dust of civil war to the marble of empire, guided by fortune and burdened by duty. If my words have given you a glimpse of the man behind the laurel, then they have served their purpose. Thank you for lending me your ear and your patience. May the story of my life remind you that even emperors are but men, striving, faltering, enduring, and that every age, like every life, is built not only on power, but on memory.